So I'm gonna start by introducing our first speaker, and then I will describe how to engage with the session if you haven't attended one of these sessions, these online sessions before. So we've got two speakers here today, and the session is on Michel Houellebecq, so a kind of special session on Welbeck, and both Claire and Françoise are specialists on this subject, and so we're really lucky to have them here today. So thank you, Claire and Françoise, for coming along and for speaking in this session of online seminars on confinement in French and Francophone literature and film. I think this is the third of our sessions, so we're hopefully kind of reviving the series now. People have had a rest over the summer. So Claire Lozier is a lecturer in French at the University of Leeds, and she's an associate researcher at the Centre Prospero at the University of Saint-Louis in Brussels. And her research interests are in French cinema, art, literature, literary theory, gender theory, and broadly speaking, the connections between aesthetics and ethics. And her first book, De l'abject et du sublime, Georges Bataille, Jean Genet, Samuel Beckett, was published by Peter Lang in 2012. And on Michel Houellebecq, Claire's recently published an article entitled Empowering Signs, Writing and Emotions in Michel Houellebecq's Platform. And that was in Open Cultural Studies in 2018. So Claire will speak, and then I'll go to our second speaker, Françoise, who I'll introduce when just before she speaks. In order to ask a question, the chat is open, so you're very welcome to ask questions as we go along in the chat. You can ask anonymous questions in the chat. If you'd like to come on screen and ask a question, please just put up your digital hand, or let me know in the chat and I can unmute you, and then you can ask a question during the Q&A at the end. So we'll have Claire, then Françoise, then a Q&A at the end, and we'll look to wrap things up before 5:30. Okay, so I'll pass over to Claire. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will let you share your screen, Claire.
Yes, so I should be able to do that now. And you can tell me whether you can see well. Is that working? Yeah?
That's working, Claire.
Okay, perfect, great. So yeah, thanks Joe for organizing the session, for having us, and thanks everybody for being here. So I'd like to start by situating Welbeck's views on the recent period of confinement in relation to those of other Francophone writers, including Laila Slimani and Wajim Wahad, who Timo Obergoker discussed in the previous session of this Confinement in French and Francophone literature and film series, in order both to provide a sense of continuity and highlight the singularity of Welbeck's approach. So while both Slimani and Wahad published diaries, 6 installments for Slimani between 18th of March and 3rd of April in Le Monde, 35 for Wahad between 16th of March and 20th of April on SoundCloud, Welbeck only published one text in the form of a letter released rather late, on 4th of May, as part of the daily short radio program Lettres d'Intérieur, Interior Letters, broadcasted on France Inter. This is the same program where on 30th of March, Annie Ernaux published another letter as part of the same series, titled « Sachez, Monsieur le Président, que nous ne vous laisserons plus nous voler notre vie. » So, no, Mr. President, that we won't let you any longer rob us from our life. So in contrast to Ernaux, who writes in the name of the people, she uses nous, to a clearly identified recipient, Emmanuel Macron, in order to denunciate the neoliberal politics of the French government and warn its president of the imminent uprising of its citizens for a fairer society. Welbeck's letter is written in the first person, uses je. It is presented as a series of réponses à quelques amis, answers to a few friends, and ends with the following prediction. Nous ne nous réveillerons pas, the slides here, nous ne nous réveillerons pas après le confinement dans un nouveau monde. Ce sera le même en un peu pire. I'm not going to read the English translations because they would be too long otherwise, so they are all there for you, but I'll let you read them. So unsurprisingly, Welbeck's letter was received with rather less enthusiasm than Ernaud's, given his rather grim take on the situation. However, in comparison to Slimani and Mourad, but also to other lockdown diarists, such as Marie Dariussec for Le Point, Welbeck was neither mocked nor criticized for his approach, and his posture as a writer was not questioned either. So I refer here to what Timo said last time. So this is, of course, partly due, this difference in approach, in treatment, in response, to the type of texts that they respectively wrote, given that the letter, of course, exposes its author significantly less than a diary, but also to the fact that Welbeck was probably the least at risk among his counterparts of falling victim to a romanticized vision of a privileged bucolic confinement, or to the wishful becoming of a better world. In typical fashion, Welbeck neither embellishes the present nor shows wishful optimism for the future. His sober approach to confinement, coupled to his long-lasting interest in secluded characters, can therefore offer profitable insights for life in, but also out of lockdown. So in the short time I have, I'm going to consider 5 situations of confinement explored in his work and letter. The solitary individual, the kidnapped celebrity, the reclusive artist, the abandoned elderly, and the secluded neo-human, in order to show that in spite of his reputation as a cynic and misanthropic author, reading Welbeck today can offer both comfort and, more importantly, means of empowerment. So the first posture of confinement I'd like to touch upon is the lonesome, solitary individual who populates Welbeck's novels and whose situation became a familiar one during lockdown. All of Welbeck's narrators and protagonists follow indeed this model. Be they informaticians, like in Extension du domaine de la lutte or Platform, scientists, as in Les Particules Élémentaires or Soumission, or Serotonin, writers, either creative in La Possibilité du Nil and La Carte du Territoire, or academic in Soumission, or painters, as in La Carte du Territoire, they all live in relative isolation. They are not particularly happy people, to say the least, and they spend most of their time pondering over the absurdity and restlessness of the world. This character type, which is often likened to Welbeck himself, draws on a romantic ideal of a hypersensitive individual, ill-adjusted to their environment, and riddled with all too human flaws. So a penchant for alcohol, longing for lust, and prone to bursts of depression. Recent scholarship has shown that those characters, who can easily be perceived as grim, sometimes even despicable anti-heroes, also actually have the ability to bring solace to their readers by echoing some of the most commonly shared experiences of inadequacy, melancholy, and despair. And I'm of course referring here to Agathe Novak Le Chevalier's 2018 book, Welbeck, L'Art de la Consolation. So she really changed the perception we have of Welbeck by taking this stance that actually Welbeck is maybe so popular, so read, because precisely he provides this comfort and this solace. So no doubt that those portraits of isolated individuals, prone to drinking too much, to suffering from physical distancing, and were in a constant state of confused dismay about the world in which they live, resonated even further with the situation in which many people suddenly found themselves during lockdown. If we except, of course, that none of Welbeck's characters have to look after children on top of that. A second Welbeckian figure now, who provides helpful insight into endured confinement, is the kidnapped celebrity, as illustrated in Guillaume Nicloux' 2014 film, L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq, The Kidnapping of Michel Houellebecq. The distinction between fiction and reality in this film is ostensibly blurred, as Welbeck plays himself, and the film is a sort of hyper-realistic docufiction. It is based on the real disappearance of Welbeck for a few days in 2011, which gave rise to speculation of his kidnapping, and imagines what would have happened if Welbeck had really indeed been kidnapped. I have a kind of selections of stills from the film here for you. So the character Michel Houellebecq, played by Michel Houellebecq, is abducted from his Parisian flat by 3 apprentice henchmen who keep him captive for the rest of the film in the semi-rural house of the parents of one of them, who are also present there. You see the poster of the film and kind of alert for kidnapping about Welbeck, and then a selection of stills from the film I'm going to comment as well. Welbeck, played by Welbeck, is abducted from his flat, is held captive, and we mainly see him in his bedroom, where he's confined, sometimes handcuffed to the bed, where his kidnappers nonetheless let him read books, drink wine, and smoke cigarettes, while they wait for the mysterious entity behind the kidnapping to pay them for the job and order Welbeck's release after his ransom has been paid. In the meantime, they all share meals together, and Welbeck has regular deep conversations with his kidnappers and their parents, as you can, for instance, see on two of the stills, in a rather relaxed atmosphere, nonetheless always feeling quite claustrophobic, given the whole film is shot indoors and in close-ups. But they nonetheless end up socializing, end up having this life that develops in this house where they're all confined, them waiting, him being kidnapped. A sort of sociability develops, and they manage to overcome their differences. They really encounter each other in a way that ends up, surprisingly, with a surprise birthday party for Welbeck, being organized by his kidnappers and their parents, the elderly parents, where they all get drunk together wearing feathery carnival masks. So you can see that here, and I could not resist but give you this picture of this rather fantastic situation. If you haven't seen the film, I would recommend it. It's particularly funny. So upon leaving the house, Welbeck writes a poem for his host and promises to come back to visit them soon. Not your usual hostage movie, but rather than exposing a simple case of Stockholm Syndrome, the film explores what happens when people find themselves suddenly confined in a closed familiar environments for reasons out of their control and are only allowed out for brief occasional walks. So a situation here, once again, reminiscent of actual lockdown. Unsurprisingly, boredom and anxiety occur. Eating and drinking take on a central role as collective activities which structure life and alleviate its repetitiveness. And disagreements and tension inevitably arise. In the case of the film, they are mostly about whether or not Welbeck can keep his lighter or get some more wine, but also about subjects as diverse as the value of literature, free fight, and fatherhood. So aside from being irresistibly funny, this absurd tale of enforced confinements, which can at times feel oppressive due to the mostly shot indoors and close-up frames, also contains the expected lockdown moral. Being forced to face oneself and others, however different from you they may be, offers a unique opportunity to address one's preconceptions and rediscovers elements of basic shared humanity through encounter and laughter. A feel-good lockdown movie of some sort, then. Ultimately, the writer, the henchmen, and the older parents learn to relate to each other, and Welbeck, the cynical, depressed, and misanthropic celebrity, reveals himself to be a compassionate, understanding, and companionable character. Interestingly, in his confinement letter, Welbeck also debunks this image of the secluded, depressed, misanthropic writer. So I'll turn to that now, to the letter itself. In the first half of this France Inter text, Welbeck gives a summary of human exchanges he had during lockdown with 3 contemporary writers identified as friends. First, with Frédéric Beigbeder on the disputed benefits of walking. Welbeck sides with walking, unlike Beigbeder. Then with Catherine Millet on the uncanny parallel between life in lockdown and the life of the neo-humans in La Possibilité du Nil. I'll come back to that in a minute. Finally, with Emmanuel Carrère on whether lockdown will give rise to good books. Welbeck doesn't think so, unlike Carrère. So the tone of the exchanges, the tone of all the exchanges is quite jaunty and colloquial. And the whereabouts of the writers are given with precision, respectively. Guattari, Pyrénées-Orientales for Frédéric Becbédé, Estagel, Pyrénées-Atlantiques for Catherine Millet, Paris and Royan, Charente-Maritime for Emmanuel Carrère.
Claire, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see the next slide. We can't see it.
Yeah, it's here, Joe. I mean, sorry.
Okay.
I haven't reached the quotes themselves yet, so...
Oh, no worries. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you meant to click onto it.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry
Thank you for reminding me of that, but they are here, let's say, for when they be needed. Cool, thanks. Yes, I was just describing the content of the exchanges there. And yeah, so what I wanted to say is that the colloquial tone of the exchanges, which is quite jaunty, and the fact that we have so many precise factual elements of the geography in which the writers themselves are located, and also the fact that they are presented as people engaged in mundane activities, such as exchanging emails, inquiring about each other's health, and discussing the necessity of going outside so as not to go crazy. All these aspects makes the letter produce a sense of proximity and familiarity upon reading it, or I should rather say, upon listening to it, as it was indeed originally broadcasted on France Inter, which is one of the most listened to radios in France. So this answers to a few friends, therefore also address us. Unlike his withdrawn characters, seeking self-isolation, Welbeck reaches out in a compassionate gesture of camaraderie through shared lockdown worries. So now I'm going to turn to the quotes themselves. However, his letter does not solely focus on individual lockdown experiences. It also addresses two phenomena about which he's been writing for a long time. First, what is called in the letter l'obsolescence des relations humaines, the obsolescence of human relationships, which, according to Welbeck, was intensified by confinement, and the fate of the sick and elderly, whose lonely deaths in hospitals and homes, en masse, was concealed behind bare numbers. His denunciation of the latter is particularly forceful, and that's the quote now I wanted to look at on these specific aspects of this forced confinement, forced lockdown situation, and the specific figure of confinement that are the sick and elderly in the context. So he writes, les gens meurent seuls dans leur chambre d'hôpital, ou d'EHPAD, on les enterre aussitôt, ou on les incinère. L'incinération est davantage dans l'esprit du temps, sans convier personne, en secret. You have the English under. So let's comment on the writing style here, the way this is written. So the feigned naivety of the question, où on les incinère, discloses the aberration of the question itself, while the mass anonymization of the dead is rendered through the use of the collective nouns and pronouns, les gens, les. But more importantly, our collective responsibility in this phenomenon is emphasized through the repeated use of the indefinite personal pronoun on, whose extension is maximal here and encompasses everybody. The denunciation goes on, continues. Un autre chiffre aura pris beaucoup d'importance en ces semaines, celui de l'âge des malades. Jusqu'à quand convient-il de les réanimer et de les soigner ? 70, 75, 80 ans ? Cela dépend, apparemment, de la région du monde où l'on vit. Mais jamais, en tout cas, on avait exprimé avec une aussi tranquille impudeur le fait que la vie de tous n'a pas la même valeur. Qu'à partir d'un certain âge, 70, 75, 80 ans, c'est un peu comme si l'on était déjà mort. So let's look again at the writing processes, the way the sentences is phrased. What's striking, of course, is the repeated uncertain definition of the certain age, 70, 75, 80, which highlights its harrowing arbitrariness, while the discursive adverb apparently foregrounds the shameless unfairness of the reported statement. And the indefinite pronoun on changes reference. So first, it designates the elderly in question. Cela dépend de la région du monde où l'on vit, so where the elderly lives, and the sick. Then it again summons our collective responsibility. Jamais, en tout cas, on n'avait exprimé as a society, is implied. For finally merging the elderly society into a person in the making. C'est un peu comme si l'on était déjà mort. So what we do now to the elderly will apply to us next, Welbeck warns. So as in his novels, the indecent treatment of the sick and elderly is foregrounded in a gesture of denunciation, the only difference being here the non-fictional nature of the context. So the disturbing back and forth movement between fiction and reality, which is characteristic of Welbeck's work, operates with particular potency here regarding the consequences of the pandemic and confinement. Not only does Welbeck's œuvre actively play on the merging of fiction and reality, as illustrated in his novels and in an exemplary way in L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq, it also frequently seems to foreshadow actual events. This visionary capacity is alluded to by Catherine Millet in her email exchange with Welbeck during lockdown, which is summarized in the letter as follows. Catherine Millet. La situation présente lui fait fâcheusement penser à la partie anticipation d'un de mes livres, La Possibilité d'une île. On which Welbeck comments. Alors là, je me suis dit que c'était bien quand même d'avoir des lecteurs, parce que je n'avais pas pensé à faire le rapprochement alors que c'est tout à fait limpide. D'ailleurs, si j'y repense, c'est exactement ce que j'avais en tête à l'époque concernant l'extinction de l'humanité. Rien d'un film à grand spectacle, quelque chose d'assez morne. Des individus vivant isolés dans leurs cellules, sans contact physique avec leurs semblables, juste quelques échanges par ordinateur, allant décroissant. We are kind of illustrating that today. So, yeah, I'd like to look again at the way this is phrased, this is expressed. The warm, relatable, conversational tone with which Welbeck addresses his friends and readers alike in his letter is particularly noticeable here, with the colloquialisms, alors là, with the non-verbal phrases, quelque chose d'assez morne, and the overall oral tone. So just as he comments on the exchanges he had on the very topic of the disappearance of human connection, he really uses this specifically relatable conversational tone. An antidote is therefore administered at the very same time as the poison is identified. Furthermore, La Possibilité d'une île, which bears a resemblance to the current situation of confinement and distancing measures, is not only a novel about the extinction of humanity and the disappearance of human interactions. It is also a book about the very opposite, the inextinguishable desire to connect with others. While the neo-humans from the book indeed lead isolated lives in their cells and only sporadically communicate with a small number of their counterparts through computers, the book ends with the departure of two of them, a woman and a man, who choose to abandon the eternal safety of their secluded life in order to physically encounter their peers and experience uniquely human feelings of love, freedom, and awe at nature, even if this ultimately means their death. So, be it in a post-apocalyptic world or in a world which will be the same but just a little worse, the desire to reach out and unite might very well be at threat, Welbeck suggests, but it is not close either to disappearing, he affirms. So to conclude, and stop here. To conclude, the various situations of confinement which are explored in Welbeck's work and which I have considered here, the solitary individual, the kidnapped celebrity, the reclusive artist, the abandoned elderly, and the secluded neo-human, all offer insights into and for life in lockdown, either by offering sympathy providing lockdown wisdom, debunking prejudices, denunciating unacceptable behaviors, or asserting the endurance of human sociability. Furthermore, in his confinement letter, rather than focusing on himself, like Slimani, Mouahad, and Dariussec, or making wishful projections, like Ernaud, Welbeck speaks to us directly to expose the effects of the pandemic and question our reaction to them. He invites us to take things seriously, not to dream nor romanticize, while also connecting strongly with his friends, readers, and listeners, thus creating a sense of community, which is both comforting and empowering in the face of adversity. And that would be it.
Thanks so much, Claire. That's fantastic, brilliant, and thank you for keeping to time. I'm just going to ask Françoise if you want to share your screen. I can introduce you while you do that. So again, just to remind you that we'll have the Q&A at the end, and if you have any questions in the meantime, you can put for Claire, you can post them in the chat. So let me. Françoise Campbell completed her PhD on the ambivalence of utopia in Michel Houellebecq's novels through a co-tutelle between the University of Melbourne and the Université Paris 7. And she has published articles in both French and English on utopia, ethics, and subjectivity in Welbeck's writing. And she's recently co-edited a special issue of French Cultural Studies on transgression in Welbeck's œuvre. So Françoise is currently based here at the IMLR, and she's a visiting fellow where she's working on the representation of subjectivity and ideological ambivalence in contemporary French novels. We're very grateful to have you, Françoise, and I'll pass over to you. Are you sharing your slides? Have you managed to?
Yes. Are they visible at the moment?
No, we can see a folder rather than the slides.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll see what I can do. Okay. Share screen. Okay, here we go. That should work.
Yeah, we can see the slides. Brilliant.
Okay, that's. Thank you, Joe, for the introduction and for putting this together. I feel like I've been quite lucky coming to this presentation, as Claire was already on board and I've interloped to a certain extent, but I'm hoping that we'll have a lot to discuss at the end of the presentation, and I can already see lots of parallels coming out through what Claire has already seen. So as we've just heard through the analysis of the various postures of confinement in Welbeck's œuvre, isolation plays a very important role in these works. Another recent study of isolation in Welbeck is Russell Williams' recent survey of novels of self-isolation, in which he compares Welbeck's writing of Ionesco's Le Solitaire. In fact, social distancing can be read as a driving theme of any number of Welbeck's novels, which are notorious for their portrayal of solitary male protagonists who struggle against the competition of the liberal market in an atomized society. However, alongside the representation of confinement and social distancing, as Claire has already introduced in her presentation, another aspect of Welbeck's writing is the recurrent desire for the kind of human connection and relationality that Alexandre Geffen's 2017 study of care has shown to be a dominant trope in contemporary French literature. In this presentation, I've got a dual front and care in Welbeck's most recent novel, Sérotonine, and his 1998 novel, Les particules élémentaires. So to do so, I'll begin by analysing the isolating forces of liberal society as depicted through its physical spaces and uncomfortable social interactions. I will then consider the need for human connection in relation to what Joan Tronto describes as an ethics of care in the Welbeckian universe, which I'll trace through the representation of relationality in the two texts, before concluding with a brief discussion of the paradoxes of care faced by Welbeck's protagonists. So there are a number of reasons why serotonin might be seen as particularly aligned with our current times, not in the least because of the way the plot appears to drag on, sharing the digressive characteristics of what Ross Chambers terms loiterature, as Douglas Murray has demonstrated. Another striking similarity is the feeling of acedia, or listless unease, that pervades the text. So as we can see through these extracts from a recent article on The Conversation, acedia was notable in the writing of 5th century monks. So once again, we can perhaps see parallels with Welbeck's Soumission as well. And this emotion is the direct result of long periods of solitary confinement, which are not unlike our current experiences of lockdown. So in Serotonin, Welbeck's protagonist, Florent Claude, is likewise subjected to various forms of solitary confinement. Notably, he moves from an apartment in the infamous Tour Totem of Paris's 15th arrondissement, in which he sleeps in the chambre d'amis in order to avoid contact with his girlfriend Yuzu, to take up residence in a room of the Mercure Hotel on Avenue Sœur Rosalie. So this hotel room is a particularly striking example of solitary confinement. And also, Welbeck's narrator observes that it plays a deciding factor in the character's ascetic slide into lethargy. So as Florent Claude observes, elle était réellement minuscule, before he goes on to describe the layout of the room in a somewhat claustrophobic manner, where the accumulation of objects is built up by the precision of their spatial proximity. So this begins with le lit double qui occupait tout l'espace and ends with le minibar et une chaise faisant face à un miroir de 30 cm de côté. So this room provides a rather apt metaphor for the character's position in his social world. So he's at once isolated, locked in, and overwhelmed by the proximity of others in a society oriented towards efficiency and productivity. So having left his girlfriend Yuzu after the discovery of her libertine and zoophilic proclivities, Florent Claude is without any human relation. His parents having died in a double suicide following the discovery of his father's brain tumor. So at this point in the novel, the character's only human interactions are those facilitated by his daily mini-circuit, wandering from his local bistrot au Jules to the Carrefour City au coin de l'avenue des Gobelins. So reduced to commercial transactions, Florent Claude's experience of the outside world is thus one of social distance, heightened by the consumerist logic of what the author has previously described as le monde comme supermarché et comme dérision. This same sense of social distance, or rather atomization, as some have already termed, can also be read across Welbeck's 1998 novel Les Particules Élémentaires, which opens with the description of its protagonist Michel's rather stilted retirement party, after which the scientist returns home to dine on his barquette de loup au cerfeuil monoprix gourmet before taking 3 Xanax, his solitude all the more marked by his view over roughly 300 other apartments. In Serotonin, the sense of isolation felt by Welbeck's protagonist brings him to reach out to his long-lost acquaintances. This is a similar sort of sense of sociability that Claire mentioned already towards the end of her presentation, this human need to interact. So Florent Claude's attempt at reconnecting with people of his past underscores a nostalgic desire for human connection at the heart of Welbeck's novel. So what I would like to suggest with the next section of this paper is that serotonin can be read as the expression, the need for care, or even an ethics of care, which can likewise be read as the utopian impulse of les particules élémentaires. So to explore this idea, I take up Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher's definition of care as a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. Sometimes referred to as relational ethics, the ethics of care is centered around the understanding of individuals' need for care and the ability of others to fulfill it. So for early care ethicists, such as Nell Noddings, this structure was envisaged as a caring dyad established between the caregiver and the care receiver. And this was frequently modeled on the mother-child relationship. So as Tronto and Fisher suggest, care ethics extends out to include any number of relationships that contribute to our well-being and so influence the way we interact with others. Although care, and particularly care professions, occupy a decidedly paradoxical place in Welbeck's novels, as I will discuss momentarily, relationality nevertheless plays a central part in his texts. It is the key to serotonin's structure, the trajectory of which is propelled by Florent Claude's attempt at making contact with the novel's other characters, who exist solely through their relationship to the protagonist. The same can be said of Les Particules, which has been described as a Zola-esque roman à thèse, tracing the family timeline of the two half-brothers, Bruno and Michel. And in fact, both novels are driven by the characters' forlorn desire to form caring relationships in a decidedly uncaring society. In Serotonin, Florent Claude first meets with Claire, an ex-lover, leading to a wine-fueled dinner during which she takes a greater interest in his Coquille Saint-Jacques than the conversation. Following this rather awkward encounter, he decides to travel to Normandy to visit his old university friend, Émeric. However, Émeric is going through a divorce and is living alone on his family estate that the character struggles to maintain through farming alone. He was eventually forced to sell off his land to the highest bidder, thus symbolizing France's loss of connection with its territory and terroir, which has become simply another product to be sold on the global market. Florent Claude is likewise unable to form a meaningful connection to this character. While Émeric lives in the estate's crumbling chateau, Florent Claude spends days on end in a tiny bungalow on the property, once again confined. So interestingly, the novel received quite a bit of criticism to include descriptions of the Normandy countryside. Florent Claude only meets with Émeric in the evenings, at which point his friend is frequently described as ayant l'air non seulement saoul, mais un peu défoncé. And once again, alcohol proves to be the very opposite of a social lubricant for Welbeck's characters. Émeric's isolation has a disastrous effect on the character, who is eventually killed during a standoff between the region's farmers and the CIS police force. The negative effects of prolonged social distancing are also experienced by Florent Claude. The character becomes increasingly removed from his reality and begins stalking Camille, an ex-girlfriend who he still pines for. Through vignettes recalling the complicity of their past relationship, reconnecting with Camille would appear to be Florent Claude's last hope. However, watching her house from a nearby bar, he soon learns, to his great disappointment, that Camille has a son. Or rather, as he states, Camille était maintenant engagée dans une relation profonde et exclusive avec son fils. For Welbeck's protagonist, this discovery signals the impossibility of establishing the kind of mutual dependence he seeks, as he cannot see a way into the caring dyad between the mother and her child. As he reasons to him, c'était lui ou moi. In comparison, the protagonists of Les Particules would appear to be more successful, albeit fleetingly, in their pursuit of relational ethics. Towards the middle of Les Particules, Bruno stays at a nudist colony in the Cap d'Agde with his lover Christiane. Based on a philosophy of sexualité social-démocrate, the colony is described by Bruno as le lieu adéquat d'une proposition humaniste visant à maximiser le plaisir de chacun sans créer de souffrance morale insoutenable chez personne. However, as one might expect in a Welbeck novel, this utopian experience of relationality soon comes to an end, as Bruno finds himself unable to care for Christiane when she falls ill, leaving the character once again alone. Bruno's half-brother Michel likewise loses the woman he loves after his childhood sweetheart Annabelle is diagnosed with uterine cancer. This experience of loss and separation leads the scientist to pursue his life's work of developing the genetic code for a new species capable of overcoming the individualism of liberal society. So this new species is introduced in the epilogue and the prologue of Les Particules, and it's notable for its first description here of the beings being enveloped in a halo of love and joy. And the neo-humans are also designated by the plural pronoun nous throughout the text, which creates a striking contrast with the isolation of the other protagonists. So Michel's neo-humans thus appear to be the solution to the ideologically programmed experiences of social distance and separation that plague the protagonists throughout the text. As Michel writes towards the end of the novel, la séparation est l'autre nom du mal, c'est également l'autre nom du mensonge. Il n'existe en effet qu'un entrelacement magnifique, immense et réciproque. The obvious drawback of this supposedly utopian vision is that it necessitates the end of humanity. Welbeck would thus appear to be suggesting that such a network of relationality and reciprocity cannot be achieved in our lifetime. In Serotonine, the experiences of Welbeck's protagonists provide a further illustration of the paradox of care facing contemporary society. In addition to Florent Claude's failed attempt at sustaining caring relationships, he is driven by his worsening depression to seek out a form of self-care when he consults a psychiatrist. This leads to a highly parodic rendering of the care profession. The psychiatrist chosen by Florent Claude is one Dr. Azot, whose name is derived from the Greek root azo, meaning lifeless. Azot is also the term for the element nitrogen, which is frequently used in agriculture as a fertilizer. So it may be unsurprising that the doctor appears more interested in increasing Florent Claude's fertility than improving his mental state. So the notion of self-care is particularly prominent in the later works of Michel Foucault, in which he outlines care of the self as a continued form of self-improvement and thus the facilitator of improved moral interaction in society. However, in Welbeck's novel, self-care has been removed from any moral implication. Instead, it is absorbed into capitalist logic and appears as a means to maintain the individual's participation in society. So this becomes evident as we follow what Dr. Azot prescribes to improve Florent-Claude's mental state, which is the antidepressant Captorix, which is intended to facilitate social behavior. So as Welbeck describes here, the function of this drug is not to alleviate suffering, but merely to ensure the participation of the individual in les rites majeurs d'une vie normale au sein d'une société évoluée. So as we can see here, the form of care offered by Captorix relies on an emotionless rendering of what it means to be part of society. So this is quite evident through the description of les rites majeurs, which are toilettes, vie sociale, réduite au bon voisinage, démarches administratives simples. And through this description, we see that the division between health and illness made by the drug is determined by simply a series of rituals. Ultimately, this chemical substance is unable to provide the sense of human connection sought by the character. Captorix causes Florent-Claude to gain weight, and he is finally diagnosed with a pathological form of heartbreak at the end of the novel. Welbeck's protagonist would thus appear to be a symbol of society's ills, brought on by uncontrolled consumption and heightened individualism. However, it is important to note that one of Florent-Claude's final acts is the construction of a wall of pictures, which he describes himself as un mur Facebook, mais à l'usage personnel. So the wall of pictures maps the trajectory of his life through his various relationships. And although the character acknowledges that this task is ultimately futile and won't provide him with the sense of connection that he seeks, Florent-Claude's activity reveals a sense of determination. As he states, j'allais les coller, les photos, j'allais les coller à sa place sur le mur sans espérer qu'ils s'en dégagent une beauté ni un sens, mais j'allais quand même continuer jusqu'au bout. Thus, despite the protagonist's continued failure throughout the novel, Serotonin concludes by expressing an innate desire for the kind of ethics of care that Tronto and Fisher describe. So granted, this conclusion may appear somewhat contradictory, perhaps even as contradictory as the actions of Welbeck's own protagonist. However, by narrating their struggles, Welbeck nevertheless encourages his reader to consider the pressing need for care in contemporary society. Whether or not we empathize with his characters, his novels bring our attention to the experiences of isolation and distance in society, thereby prompting the questions needed to repair our world. As Geffen explains, la théorie du care est une théorie morale asymétrique qui ne suppose pas l'échange complet des positions ni la ressemblance absolue, mais une modification de l'attention dirigée vers de nouvelles questions et de nouveaux sujets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. That was thank you for that fascinating paper, and thank you, Claire, as well, for a brilliant paper as well. So I'm going to open it up to the discussion. If you do have a question and you'd like to come on camera, like I said, please do raise your digital hand or let me know in the chat, and I can unmute you. And you can come on camera, or you can ask a question in the chat anonymously. If you would like to come on screen, then just to let you know, we are recording the session, and the session will go on the IMLR's website afterwards. But thanks a lot, Françoise and Claire. Maybe I can start while people kind of gather their questions. I'm struck, really. I mean, there's so many interconnections between your papers. Maybe you might want to have a discussion with one another, which would be quite nice. It'd be quite nice for us to see where you see the interconnections between your papers. I'm struck really by, I suppose more a comment, just listening to you both, this kind of the question of how we can actually reconcile this ethics of care, or this turn for desire for connection, between that desire for connection, or that ethics of care, with the utter hopelessness, what seems like the utter hopelessness of the characters in his novels. And I don't know if you wanted to comment on that a bit more, because I think, speaking to colleagues about Welbeck and reading Welbeck, I think a lot of them, encounter this as not necessarily a very pleasant process. And I'm wondering how you kind of reconcile those two things. That's to both of you, really. And if either of you would like to respond, please jump in.
I respond.
Thanks, Claire.
I think what's specific about Welbeck's text and his novels, and the reason why it triggers these two types of reactions, is actually because they contain both set of attitudes. As indeed, all his characters are these rather sad, grim, lonesome, sometimes not particularly pleasant people. But he kind of portrays that, but that's not the whole picture. It's part of the immediate character type, I guess, we encounter. But then you also have all the irony of the narrator. You have all the humor traits as well, all the self-ironizing linguistic effects or speech effects that accompanies these characters. And you have to take all these elements into account to actually reconcile these two sides. As in, yes, they are indeed sad, lonely people, but they also, and the narrator, or they also have this kind of understanding towards them, this kind of they are never judged, these people, for instance. They are never blamed for their thoughts, for their behaviors. There is always a sense of kind of I'm looking for the word how to describe that. Acceptance, perhaps, a kind of like reaching a hand to them, thanks to humor, thanks to self ironizing processes and to irony. So we recognize flaws, but rather than judging flaws and rejecting flaws, there is a sense of let's recognize the sheer humanity behind them, the sheer suffering, the sheer loneliness, and that brings actually the two together. So in a gesture of reaching a hand. That's the way for me that I can reconcile these two aspects.
Yeah. Thanks, Claire.
Yes, I'll just I agree entirely with what Claire was saying about the.
Oh, we seem to have lost Françoise. Hopefully she can reconnect. I have a question. While Françoise tries to reconnect, there is a question in the chat which you might want to respond to, Claire. The question is, how does Welbeck see nationalism as a form... We momentarily got Françoise back, but she's gone again. How does Welbeck see nationalism as a form of care? See nationalism as a... Sorry, Françoise, you're back. We lost you there. Do you want to... Sorry, I think Claire's response to the question about nationalism is probably we could shelve that one for now. And then did you want to come back, because we can see you again? Did you want to repeat? Sorry, what you were saying there?
Yes. So I'll just very briefly say that in addition to what Claire was explaining about the fact that the depressive elements of Welbeck's works are never alone, they're always coupled with a sense of hope. I think that's illustrated really well by the fact that a lot of his so-called dystopian or utopian texts are very, very hard to pin down and very hard to read as solely dystopian or solely utopian. They've always got this sense of ambivalence and there are certainly positive aspects for his characters in the book, even though the reader might read them and think that's utterly horrible.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Françoise. Sorry, there was a question in the chat which I was just reading to Claire, which I can now put to both of you. The question is, how does Welbeck see nationalism as a form of care? If indeed he does at all. Claire, do you have any particular response to that?
My first reaction is no, I don't have a response. But actually, I'm actually wondering now, I mean, does Welbeck see nationalism as a form of care? I mean, I guess I would need the question to be a bit unpacked, to be a bit straight away. I'm sorry to Nagian, but I don't understand the question. And
okay, so if the questioner would like to add to their question or
maybe
or clarify,
Françoise,
would you?
How you understand?
Okay.
Hello, sorry. I think
Hi,
our questioner is online.
No, I just unmuted myself. So I was thinking of because something you already mentioned about caring about the terroir and caring about France and not letting it go, that, and also in Submission, sort of you've got these elements of caring for the nation. If you don't care for the nation, you don't care for yourself, or if you don't care for yourself, you don't care for the nation. So if you're nationalistic, it's almost like, yeah, you're caring. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming on.
Yes, thanks for elaborating. I think there are certainly some aspects of soumission that might lead to that reading of nationalism as a kind of care. I don't know if the things that are springing to my mind are the way that the narrator describes his girlfriend Miriam's attachment to her French identity, and how that gives her, and also her religion, and how that gives her a sense of belonging and purpose. And it's certainly something that the narrator of Soumission lacks entirely. And I think he does express a certain amount of regret, but once again, because it's Welbeck, there's irony through the way he expresses that regret as well. So I think it's an interesting point, but I'd have to think more about it.
As for landscapes, actually, and care for the terroir, like Nagian just elaborated, I was trying to think. Okay, so indeed, Welbeck writes a lot about French terroir, like Normandy, Limousin, Creuse, wherever. Which indeed makes him a very French writer. So I guess, yeah, that's really striking about his text, that indeed they engage in a quite close, affectionate, also sometimes ambivalent way with the terroir. It's never totally positive, not totally negative. There is a kind of balanced and questioning description, engagement with the terroir. But then I was thinking as well, he also describes like the Irish landscape quite a bit in some of his novels, and also the Spanish landscapes, where his characters sometimes spend time. And instinctively, I feel that the type of engagement he has with the Irish landscape and the Spanish landscape is kind of similar to the ones he has with the French one, as in he's very much attached to the materiality, the reality of the environment. And in some ways, there could be more a sense of nostalgia than of nationalism, as in what matters is the beauty and the resources and the richness of these landscapes and their specificity, be they Irish and super wet and foggy and rainy, or Spanish and dry and rocky, and what he seems to care for is the specificity, the diversity of this. Like we could tell the biodiversity of these landscapes. We could do a Welbeck environmental reading, eco-poetics in Welbeck, and it does that against the kind of flattening of those landscapes and the destruction actually of those landscapes by destroying their specificity, their unicity, and this aspect. So thank you for this question, because that's kind of interesting reflection to have. Thank
you, Claire, and thank you to the questioner as well. So I got another question on the chat from Ruth Cruikshank, and Ruth is asking, can I ask about gendered care? A stereotypical view of Welbeck would be he does not care about women, and that he tends to cast them stereotypically as those doing the labour of care. Perhaps, Françoise, you might want to respond to that first, and then we can see if I'll pass on to Claire.
Yes, I think that's a very important point to bring up, especially if like I'm trying to do, you want to bring in the notion of care ethics, which is based in feminist scholarship. It's a bit of a tenuous link to make to Welbeck in that respect. I think that said, there is something that could link in well with the way that most of Welbeck's protagonists express this kind of maternal lack, and most of them have gone through an experience of abandonment by their maternal figures at one point or another. In Les Particules, certainly, the characters seem to be the way he represents it. They're quite scarred by the lack of maternal care, and in retrospect they have a very important relationship with their grandmothers. Once again, like Ruth brought up, the female character is doing the labor of care in those relationships, but yes, I'd still think that that desire for maternal care is an important aspect of all of Welbeck's texts, and it's also something that Bruno Viard has written about towards the end of a number of his books on Welbeck.
Thank you, Françoise. Claire, did you have any response to that question on gendered care?
It's not exactly a response to that, but it's kind of following maybe this question about the labor of care, because I was thinking indeed like Welbeck's male character don't do any labor of care towards women. Indeed, women are there to provide that. But then what I was actually thinking is that the only entities toward which Welbeck's male character provides labor of care are animals. And indeed, several novels, he cares a lot about his dogs. So they are able, these male characters, of caring for people who need care. But it's displaced, indeed, towards another person or entity. So that would need to be squared in some ways, but that needs to be explored indeed a bit further. Yeah.
Yes.
The role of caring and.
Well, and of course, the animal is not another person, is it? I mean, in terms of, I suppose the question on the back of that is, how does he deal? How does he approach this relationship between the human and the animal in his work? I mean, that's something that occurs to me. We've got another question, which I'll put to both of you, if I may. This is for you, Claire, I think. Yeah. Claire seemed to suggest that Welbeck's fiction provides solace and empowerment because his isolated, flawed protagonists resonate with common experience. But does the simple fact of recognising oneself in literature, however grimly, empower the reader?
So I misexpressed myself then. I didn't want to suggest that all aspects of his fiction provide both solace and empowerment. My approach was more that some of these aspects provide solace, and that can be indeed when you can share a feeling, or you can share experiences of inadequacy, of depression, of boredom, of And that indeed can provide solace when you recognize these flaws in others. But that I didn't want to say at all that that provides empowerment. The empowerment part was more in other aspects of the points I've tried to discuss and present. And the empowerment aspect I wanted to highlight was more to do with the letter itself, Welbeck letters itself, when he addresses some of the problems that occur during lockdown, and by foregrounding them and by addressing them and by, I suppose, touching on people's responsibility, on our own responsibility, that can be empowering if we therefore become able to act as a result of this consciousness, of this awareness of the collective responsibility. But I separated these two aspects. There was the solace on one side, thanks to the identification and to sharing this, to recognizing one's own flaws, perhaps. And the empowerment aspect was, with something else. So I apologize if I confuse these two aspects.
Thanks, Claire. I guess off the back of that, perhaps a question to both of you is about the relationship between the different forms that you've spoken about today. So Claire, you mentioned non-fiction, the status of non-fiction alongside fiction, but also you discussed a film that Welbeck made, and Françoise, you discussed principally novels. So I wondered if there is, is there a singularity of film as a form for Welbeck? I mean, I know this is something new for him, and the novels came first. I'm right in thinking, Claire, maybe you answer that question first. I mean, I think you've worked on the films a bit more. Am I right in thinking?
Yeah, so that's what I'm trying to do at the moment precisely, is to study the Welbeck as a filmmaker, Welbeck as an actor, Welbeck as a film director, and also all his comments on films that appear in his texts, in his novels, and in his essays. So there seem to be indeed some differences between Welbeck as a novelist and Welbeck as a film person. To me, I think that there is much more humor transpiring through his films, through his take on visual images. But he's also very critical of cinema. He basically destroys French cinema after the arrival of speaking film. So it's kind of complex, his relationship to cinema, and I'm trying to figure it now, basically. So I would happily provide a new paper at some point about all the specificities of Welbeck's relationship to film. But I think of course, it's different. His take on it, his ways of addressing it than his novels.
Thanks, Claire. I don't know if it's unfair to ask you to respond to that question, Françoise, given you didn't actually talk about the film.
No, I mean, I completely agree with what Claire has said about the humour in Welbeck's film appearances. I think they're much more lighthearted. And I think Thalasso is also a really interesting one to consider alongside L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq. And I was thinking certainly about the parody of care in that film, and also the way that the plot is it's driven by a very similar sort of situation in terms of the human interaction and connections between people kind of leading the plot, because the whole story begins when the elderly couple in L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq breaks up because the wife, I can't remember the character's name, but she leaves her husband for another man, and the whole trajectory of the movie is about trying to get the couple back together. So I think there's something to be said about that as well, that hopefully Claire can add to. But in terms of like a comparison, I think we can also consider like the difference between Welbeck's early fiction and his later fiction. And I honestly feel like in Les Particules élémentaires there was a greater sense of hope, and more initiative around envisaging new modes of social interaction and connection than we see in Serotonin, which is a very, very isolating text.
Thank you, Françoise. Sorry, I was just reading. Would you like to add to that, Claire?
No, I think it's a very nice point indeed. Just to say the fact that, you have interest into reconnecting people, bringing them back together. So the plot of the movie that Françoise was just highlighting, that the sequel, Thalasso being a sequel of L'Enlèvement de Michel Houellebecq, as in designed to bring the characters back up together. It's another argument towards the connecting aspect of his œuvre.
Thanks, thank you. So more questions coming in, so I'll just keep kind of reeling them off if you don't mind, and tell me if you need to stop. So someone a question about reception here. Can you elaborate on how Welbeck is discussed within the French discourse and how this has changed over the years? In Germany, he's often depicted as a scandalous writer of the political right. And the question is asking, the question is saying they'd be interested if the situation in France is similar. Françoise?
Yes, sure. I think I get the impression, I'm not an expert on Welbeck's reception in German scholarship, but I had that he received more attention in Germany before he did in France. And French Academy took their time in turning their attention to Welbeck and taking his novels seriously in terms of literary analysis. But that's definitely changed, and it's I think it reached its peak in around 2016-17, when Agathe Novak-Le Chevalier coordinated an enormous compendium of scholarly work on Welbeck for Cahiers de l'Herbe. So it's a very big, prestigious tome, and I think that really illustrates Welbeck's arrival in French scholarly criticism. And through that text coming out, and through Agathe's work as well, you can also see a slight shift in terms of the way he's received, and people are moving away from kind of the deterministic, depressive readings of Welbeck that really marked his entry into the literary field, towards more kind of contemplative. I think it really, really still depends on who you speak to. It's still a lot of contestation, but I feel like there's more variety in the criticism. Some people see him as much more poetic and consolatory, and some still quite depressive and right-wing, etc.
And just to add that, indeed, one question that keeps arising is, okay, why is he so successful? Why do so many people read him and enjoy reading him? And I guess that was a bit the point of departure from Agathe Novak-Le Chevalier also book is, okay, we have to think seriously about this success. I mean, people are not all extreme political right readers, and I mean, I'm certainly not, and I enjoy reading Welbeck's text. And so I think indeed, I mean, like you said, Françoise, that the reception has really changed in France over the last few years, because I guess people didn't really understand at first why he was so popular and why he was so successful, right, while writing these quite easily readable novels. I mean, one argument also for Welbeck's popularity and success abroad is precisely that he's easy to translate, because his style is made of, indeed, everyday words, of quite oral, phrasing, and even if it's very culture specific, to French culture specific, but it's nonetheless easy to translate, and therefore easy to read. And I guess this reception has changed because people have got used basically to this unusual writer in the French worldwide literary sphere, and yeah, like attitudes have changed in response to I guess being more getting used to this voice that's indeed very difficult to pin, and the sense just of pure enjoyment and pure laughter at reading Welbeck. I personally don't find Welbeck depressing. I mean, when I read Welbeck, I just laugh so very much often. That there is definitely this component in this book. I mean, then we might be less receptive to it. Of course, that varies. But this, once again, this self-irony, comical features are there, and they're efficient, and that might have helped him becoming less hated, let's say, because when you touch people by making them laugh and by giving them some comfort through shared difficulties, that kind of speak to people at some point after a while. But that's interesting to see indeed that the reception is different according to different countries even still now.
Yeah, thanks Claire. There's a question here about reading and the kinds of reading Houellebecq describes or invites in his fiction. So, for example, the questioner says that there are scenes of settling down with some reasonable wine and flicking through a familiar book, and the prose itself lends itself to this sort of careless reading. So, as readers, do we have to suspend or alter critical forms of attention to get at these questions of care and attentiveness in his fiction? So do we have to kind of suspend our critical ways of reading in order to understand this question of care in Houellebecq? Claire? Or
maybe more Françoise for the care side?
Sorry, Françoise.
I'm not sure. I think, I'd be really interested to hear more about that aspect. But the way I was thinking about the notion of care in his texts was necessitating a critical reading in terms of the very lack of care experienced by his characters, and I think that it's a really driving theme. But I think there's definitely a distinction between the experience of care and some perhaps more the consolation aspects of reading Welbeck, than the expression of a need for care in his narratives. So I think this question is more relating to that kind of almost bibliotherapy experience that might be derived from reading about the experiences and shared experiences of Welbeck's characters.
Thanks, Françoise. Claire, would you like to respond to that, or should I move on to another question?
I mean, I see there was a question, so...
Yeah. So there's a question here about the distinction made by Hannah Arendt between isolation, loneliness, and solitude. And the question is wondering if this is relevant to Houellebecq's work. So the distinction she makes between isolation, loneliness, and solitude. And the question is saying, it seems to them that what's been mostly discussed so far through care is not isolation, but loneliness. And he quotes, "When I'm alone and without company, but desire and cannot find it." Isolation for Arendt is an apolitical state whereby, being completely cut off from my fellow human beings, I am powerless, therefore enthralled to terror, therefore ready to be controlled by a totalitarian state. Isn't what Welbeck's isn't it what Welbeck is mostly going for? Isn't this what Welbeck is mostly going for? As to solitude, where, quote, I am alone but keep myself company, notably through dialogue with fellow thinkers. I wonder if there, and this is the questioner, I wonder if there are any instances of that in Welbeck's novels. In Soumission, for example, is the narrator in dialogue with Huysmans. Sorry, that's a long question. Do let me know if you want me to clarify any element of that. Perhaps the questioner might clarify if he would like to.
It's a very good question, though.
A good question, yeah. Claire, do you want to? Or Françoise, whoever you want to.
Is to actually think that because those narrator characters are always speaking, it's very often first-person narrative. In some ways, there is a sense that this voice is always in relating something. This voice is never alienated from the speaking sphere, or from a shared language, or from a shared relating space. That's precisely happening through text, through telling stories, through sharing one own state of isolation. And indeed, with regard to Soumission, that's actually a very good example to take, because there is in the threat to give in a titled state. So then there would be an exposition to that, but once again, exposing the threat, acknowledging the threat, but acknowledging it doesn't mean approving it, or doesn't mean giving into it. So I acknowledge, but by acknowledging, I'm not embracing what I show, and the very fact of acknowledging, discussing, exposing also brings a critical distance and give the critical means to distantiate oneself and to dissociate oneself from that possibility of isolation, which is exposed as such, but not embraced as such, because precisely the language that's developed around it helps at the same time maintain a link, but also build critical distances, I would say.
Thanks, Claire. Françoise, did you have anything to add to that?
Not a lot, but I would just say that Douglas Murray has written an article about stillness and solitude in Welbeck's novels, and I think that might provide a nice link, like comparison there. He outlines the kind of reflexive contemplation that goes on throughout Welbeck's œuvre, and I think it certainly links to La Possibilité du Nil, and the clone writing his journal and kind of reflecting, and through that process coming to new understandings of his life.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Françoise. I'm probably gonna let you both go, because we've had you here for a good half an hour, interrogating you both about your papers, and there are no more questions in the chat. So just to thank you both for your time and for your brilliant papers and really wonderful contribution to the series. And I'm hoping that we'll pick this up again, pick up the discussion on confinement more generally in the series. So keep an eye out on our website, which is modernlanguages.sas.ac.uk. And there are also many other online events which you can look at and then view past recordings of online. So do check out the website. And yeah, just remains for me to thank Françoise and Claire, and to thank all of you for contributing to the discussion. And yes, that was really wonderful. So thank you very much. We'll give you a kind of virtual round of applause. Yeah,
and thank you everybody for the questions as well, because there was really questions that trigger thoughts. So that's to be continued.
To be continued, absolutely.
Yes, thanks everyone.